Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be back again. See all your smiling faces. I've got one sad announcement today. Probably not many of you know her, but Mrs. Alice Logan of Walnut Ridge, Arkansas, died this last week. And she's important in a way to me because she was a member of my very first church. The first church I ever pastored was a combination of two church circuit of Little Rock, Arkansas, and Memphis, Tennessee. Did Mrs. Logan go to Memphis or Little Rock mostly? Memphis, that's what, because it's a little closer that direction for her, even though she lived in Arkansas. She was old and full of years when she finally died, because, as I say, it was 1961 when I was the pastor of the Little Rock and Memphis churches, and would speak in Little Rock in the morning and Memphis in the afternoon with a 150-mile drive in between them over two-lane roads. It was an interesting Sabbath every week, a rather tiring one, I might add. It would sweat my shirt out completely in the morning service and have to change in the car going on over to Memphis in the afternoon. Those were what we used to kind of refer to as the good old days. I'm glad I don't have to do that anymore. But Allie and I were able to visit Mrs. Logan 2 years ago when we were coming back from our vacation, and it was kind of like old times again to be with her. She died apparently of a lung disease, something like black lung disease, although it wasn't black lung disease. But she lives in that area up there where an enormous amount of spraying is done over cotton fields, as so much of eastern Arkansas is. And I don't know if that had anything to do with what happened to her, but she did pass away this last week, and we've been thinking about her a great deal, and I know that she was on the prayer list of many of the people in the church. Last week, we had a really successful Meet the Teacher session in Dallas. I was kind of surprised in a way, or, I didn't know how many people to expect overall because we didn't know how many people from the church would actually come to this. I think we had fewer people from the church than we normally have in Terrell, but we still had a very strong representation. Between the morning and afternoon service, we were guessing at around 125 people altogether who came. And I'm pretty sure that the number of new people from radio would have been in the neighborhood of 30, probably a little bit over 30. These are people brand new to us, to our teachings and the things that we believe. I don't think I talked to all of them who were there. I was watching my audience all the time and picking up, but you can't concentrate on what you're trying to say and count the audience at the same time. But still, that's the impression that I was left with. What we did, for your information, the morning session was there and will be here a give and take interactive session talking about what's going on in the world in the light of the Bible. We got involved in prophecy in no small amount in the morning discussion. It went really where the audience kind of wanted it to go. And we will do the same thing. And I want all those who will come and visit us here in Tyler, and I hope that anyone on the tape program who hears me make this announcement, within range of Tyler at all, will come on down and join us on that day and give us your support. We'll be very happy to have you there asking questions and making comments and helping me out with all the new people who come there. And I don't really know how many people will show up here in Tyler. It's almost impossible to judge. Dallas, we had something over 30. In Tulsa, we had something close to 24, and that was a weekly station there. We're on 2 weekly stations here in Tyler, both very strong, good times. And the audience in Tyler is really not inconsequential. Just this last week, when I went in to get some eye drops at the pharmacy, and I gave my prescription already been phoned in, and I went in to pick up my prescription, and for some strange reason it wasn't ready. The girl had to go get it, and then she had to go back and see the pharmacist. And when she gave it to the pharmacist came walking out front and says, "Ronald Dart?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you the Ronald L. Dart I listen to every Sunday morning on the radio?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I want to shake your hand." And he just, was very complimentary about the program. That makes 2 pharmacists, 3 doctors, 2 nurses. I mean, I spend a lot of time in the medical community because I'm getting older. 2 used car salesmen. And I think I'm forgetting some others that are on my list of people that I run into. Oh, and a veterinarian. That listen to the radio program on a fairly regular basis. And I was kind of surprised. I asked one of my doctors, I said, well, I didn't exactly tell him I'm surprised he listened to my program, but I expressed a comment about it. And he said, doctors have a habit of getting up early in the morning. And he said, your program on Sunday morning is on right while I'm getting my first cup of coffee and getting myself alive for the day. And I think maybe the reason that he mentioned that is because I mentioned that it was the third of the doctors that I see for one thing or another that had listened to the program. He said, well, we're all up early on Sunday morning, and your program is on a station, I guess, that's a very popular, easy music listening station around Tyler. And so that's where they keep their radios during the week, and it's on Sunday morning when they get up and make their coffee. So, I mean, it is a constant surprise to me how many people I run into around town that know the program, listen to the program on a regular basis. So it's coming August the 19th here in Tyler at the Sheraton Inn, for those of you listening out there on the tape program. It's in the 5900 block of South Broadway. It's 1 mile, I think you said, didn't you, from the south from the loop. We'll be meeting at 10:30 and 2 p.m. And again, we invite everybody to come in from whatever distance you'd like to come in to join us on this and give us your support on this day, and of course meet any new people who show up because we do definitely want to make them welcome. One of the things about the Dallas Meet the Teacher that I was not entirely surprised at the number of people who showed up. I was surprised at the number of people who showed up in Tulsa, and that gave me a clue as to what was beginning to happen. We seem to have reached a point where a change is taking place, where some of the growth from radio is beginning to become apparent. We're now on, 125 or so radio station? 120 radio stations, 21 daily? Something like that. We can't keep up with them. They keep moving around, changing and adding new ones. And the mailing list now is probably around 6,500 who are new to us from radio. And it's, pardon? More than that. Getting close to 7,000? Okay. I don't know. We are adding oftentimes in a given week. We'll have 1 week, just recently, we added 75 brand new people to the final 1 week. Each week. Pardon? Oh, that was just on the weekend. I didn't count the rest of the week. Okay, I'll get it right. Thank you for your help. But anyway, the number of people showing up from radio now is increasing. But the thing that surprised me about the Dallas meeting was how far along the people were who came to that meeting as a result of the radio program. And by how far along, I'm referring to the sophistication of the questions they were asking about the Bible, about our beliefs, about prophecy, and I don't know how to explain this, but an intelligent, inquisitive interest in the Bible and what we teach. One of the areas that surprised me was that they seemed to be quite aware of the fact that we keep the holy days. One gentleman asked Allie for a holy day calendar, and they were very interested in the observance of the holy days. And when I thought about it for a while, though, it made me realize that what's actually happening is what I had set out to do in the first place, and I guess I had kind of not had the faith or necessarily realized how fast it would begin to bear fruit. That the approach that I have taken is, rather than trying to build a mailing list, and then working with the mailing list and using the radio broadcast as a form of advertising to build the mailing list and expecting that it's through literature and all this stuff that you bring people along. I realized that in a small, outfit like ours, without the literature base, without a magazine, that was not really a viable proposition for us. So what I did was set out to say to myself, when you get these people on the radio and talk to them, they say that for every person who actually contacts you, there are 1,000 listeners that didn't contact you. So my thought was, why don't I go ahead and work with the whole 1,000 rather than working with the one that calls us or writes to us with literature later? And so I basically determined that whenever I came to something that was one of our beliefs in the Bible, one of our unique beliefs, that I would take the time to explain it. I have even done a program about the identity of Israel in the modern age. Whatever it is, that I deal with it on the air in some detail. And in a sense, even in a station where we're only on once a week, a person gets the equivalent in a month of 4 or 5 long, detailed magazine articles coming right into their home on the radio. Because, basically, when I get through going through an entire program, I have taken the time that it would have taken them to have read a rather long magazine article. So the approach, then, in a sense, is to approximate a monthly magazine and to include in some depth the material that is there and not worry about whether I'm going to offend someone or not. And an interesting thing has happened in this. I'm just taking a little time because I think it's good for everybody to kind of understand what our philosophy is. The interesting thing that has happened in this regard is we don't seem to be offending many people. Now, I think in times gone by, there has been a worry about causing people to stumble over our doctrines or become offended at some doctrine that we have that's a bit unusual for them. And I've come to realize that it is not the doctrine that causes people to stumble. It's the manner of presentation that causes people to stumble. You get in their face, you tell them how stupid they are, you tell them what rotten people their ministers are, you condemn all the theologians of the world, etc. So you go through this whole rigmarole of a condemning approach to people, and people are going to stumble over what you tell them. On the other hand, if you take a kinder, gentler, if I may use that term, approach, a more positive approach, if you walk alongside your audience and talk to them instead of talking down to them, it's been my experience now over some 4 or 5 years that we've been doing this, that people don't stumble over the truth. They really don't, not very often. That by and large they are encouraged, they're excited to find it, and they're much more responsive to it than I ever imagined that they would be. So consequently, we had a really good session last week, as I say, and I have no idea what to expect in Tyler, because Tyler is a much smaller population than Dallas, so I don't expect anything like, and also we're only on weekly here instead of on daily. But I don't expect anything like that response here in Tyler. But I do think we will have some new people from radio who will come along, want to meet us, talk to us, get acquainted. And I hope that perhaps some of them will be invited to church, to come to church with us, and will enjoy fellowship with us, because we have a very special, I think, relationship in our church here in Tyler. We are maybe a small church. We are an intimate church. We love one another. Everybody knows one another. And I think that people would feel made very much at home here. Took a look at Buddy Brown today because I wanted to be sure I knew how long it was to the feast. For those of you who don't know Buddy, he wears a little lapel pin every week that tells us how many days are left to the feast. And as I make this today, it's 70 days to the Feast of Tabernacles. That's 10 weeks, folks. It's coming very, very fast, and it'll be here before we know it. The Festival Association, out of sight and out of mind for many of you people I know, have been working like a bunch of beavers to ensure that you have the best feast you ever had in your life this year. We've got a good sermon schedule, as we always have it. We have also this year again, a good set of workshops and seminars that will send you home feeling that, being filled, improved, more knowledgeable, more aware, uplifted, and able to, fulfill your walk with God. So I hope you'll be able to attend the workshops and seminars this year. We've got activities planned for every age group laid out this year. When the first year at the feast in Kissimmee, we had people fill out a questionnaire, and one of the dominant things that people told us they wanted was more opportunities for fellowship, more opportunities to meet new people, to get to know people, and so forth. And so we took that seriously, and we have tried our best to do this. And this year we'll have activities for every age group, from the youngest to the oldest. We'll have all the traditional favorites, pie and ice cream night and so forth, and some fresh opportunities as well. We haven't forgotten the teens. There are several, I think, really interesting teen activities going to be going on down there, not only the ones that we are sponsoring, but also some sponsored by the other festivals that are going on in the area. So a lot of activity for teens there. A lot of work is going on into it as well, and especially in the area of Sabbath schools for the children. I mean, it's going to be a pretty spectacular set of classes and ideas that will be presented this year. I'm not going to, raise the curtain on everything that's going to be happening, but I think you will be very impressed with some of the stuff that happened in the Sabbath schools, the YEA program for kids this year, for people from age 3 to age 19. No effort has been spared this year to have a really great Sabbath school program. And we have Youth Day this year, which is going to be, I think, unique. It certainly is the first time we have ever done it, and I don't really think any of the churches in our tradition have ever done this. On Youth Day this year, there's not going to be anybody, as far as I know, and I think this is the plan. There will be no one on the stage over 30 this year for the Youth Day. It will be Youth Day from the ground up. This is the day when every one of the youth choirs will be singing, and you all know how much fun that is. I think this probably is going to be the best attended service by angels of any of them that we do. I think the angels come, and when the children sing, I think God is pleased. I think everyone rejoices, because the Bible says, in the mouths of children you have perfected praise. And so this particular praise service is going to be a child's service, a children's service, teens, children, young adults perhaps. We're working on some things I think that will surprise you, things that, as far as I know, have never been done in our tradition before. So I hope that all of you who are in the area will make it a point to be there and give the kids your support on Youth Day. I think I can promise you that you will be inspired by that day. The title of this sermon today, when it appears on cassette tapes, may not inspire a lot of people to listen to it. The title is The Wrath of God. I think it's fair to say that a lot of people don't see what God has to be angry about. You know, why in the world would God be so mad about some of the things going on down here in the world? I mean, maybe a little bit annoyed, maybe a little bit off-put, but angry? Wrathful? When they read scriptures about the wrath of God, they shiver a little bit, but they really, I think, don't understand. And someone recently on one of the forums asked the question as to why God had to kill the firstborn of Egypt just to get the Israelites out. They said, after all, he's God, isn't he? And he's sovereign. He's all-powerful. Couldn't he have found a better way to get the children of Israel out of Egypt than to have to kill all the firstborn of Egypt? The kids hadn't done anything, had they? To us, the generations of Israelites held in slavery is just so many words on paper. You know, we read it, we open the Bible, we know what's there, and we forget. We don't have a grasp, I think, for this to really understand why God did what he did. Not only why he did it, why it had to be done that way. Now, I'm going to take a shot today at trying to help you understand the wrath of God, to understand the anger of God. And I want you to turn back to the first chapter of the book of Exodus, to a passage of Scripture that's fairly familiar, I think, to most of us, but one which I think has not been explored in the kind of depth that it needs. In Exodus 1, verse 1, it says, "These are the names of the children of Israel that came into Egypt. Every man and his household came with Jacob. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was already in Egypt." This is the people that came down there. "And Joseph died then, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful. They increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. They were rapidly becoming a serious problem to the Egyptians. And the Egyptians, having thought this over, decided that instead of having the Israelites as a problem, they might as well have them as an asset. There rose up a new king over Egypt that never knew Joseph. And he said to his people, 'Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we.'" There were more of them. And you can understand, of that being the case, why people might start getting a little antsy, that if these people who outnumber us decided to try to overthrow us, they probably could succeed. Let's deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass when there falls out any war, they join also to our enemies and fight against us, and so we wind up getting thrown out of the land. Anyway, therefore they set over them taskmasters to afflict them with burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were grieved because of the children of Israel. Let's put them to work. Let's work them from dawn to dusk. Let's don't give them time to have any babies and continue multiplying like this. But they kept right on multiplying. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and brick, and all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. It's just words on paper. Just words on paper. Until you have felt the lash across your own back. It's just words on paper. Until you have had to get out of bed in the morning with your feet so sore you can hardly stand on them, and stagger out and go to work one more time on nothing more than a little bowl of soup and a little piece of bread. That's all you get for a whole day's ration of food. Until you have actually been that hungry. Until you have been weak from hunger and still had to go to work. Until you have had to walk on bloody feet out to carry on your work, because if you don't, you're going to die at the end of the day. It's just so many words on paper. I'm really sorry that I lack the powers of description to impress upon the mind of man what this is really like. But if you want to get a grip on it, try Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish psychiatrist in Germany in the 30s. And like every other Jew, he was sent to concentration camps. He survived it, and he tells his story. He doesn't, it's not lurid. It's not one of those things that's designed to try to make you, sick as you read it. It's just factual. And he describes more the mind of this, because he's a psychiatrist, of the people who actually went through the slavery of this period of time. Now, the reason I'm trying to impress this upon your mind is that the Egyptians, who were going to suffer at the hands of God, had made the children of Israel to suffer untold agonies, not for a few days, not for a few weeks, but throughout the entirety of their lives for generations. Generations. No one still lived, really, among the Israelites who had ever talked to an Israelite who had been a free man. None of them. They heard stories. They knew the stories they had memorized, but they didn't know much else. We live so well, even the poorest of us, that we cannot grasp the degradation and the death that is absolutely inseparable from slavery. We cannot grasp the diminution of human life all the way to infanticide that was a part of it. In verse 15, the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of the which the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other was Puah, and their names are recorded from history for a reason. He said, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and you see them upon the stools, if it be a son, kill him. If they're on the birthing stool, and the child comes out, you see it's a boy, just whack his head on the stone and kill him where he is. If it be a daughter, she can live. It was Pharaoh's intent to kill half of the newborn babies among all the Israelites. Half. But the midwives feared God. They wouldn't do that. They saved the men children alive. And the king of Egypt called the midwives in and says, what are you doing? Why have you done this? And of course their lives were at risk on this. And the midwives said to Pharaoh, well, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They're lively. They are delivered before the midwife can get there. Yeah, in many cases I think they were. They were out working in the field and got in labor pains and had their baby in the field and went on doing some work thereafter. These were tough women who were having these children. And therefore, he said, then Pharaoh, it came to pass, therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, he made them houses. Now the next verse is the one that I think is very important and has been, I think, maybe overlooked. Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. Had you ever noticed that all the Egyptians were involved in this atrocity? It wasn't just Pharaoh. It wasn't just his army. It wasn't just a few platoons of soldiers. He told all his people that whenever a Hebrew baby, if it's a boy, you throw this child into the river. Now this takes on special meaning when you realize, this question the woman asked about the death of the firstborn in Egypt. Why did God do that? Because he could have delivered them another way. This is the reason. It's because the Egyptians had destroyed who knows how many thousands of Hebrew babies over how long a period of time, callously, throwing all these little boys in the river for the crocodiles and to drown. That's what was being done to Hebrew children. Now, what is oftentimes not understood about God, and I will come back to this, is that God is a God of justice. You can't let things like this go. Crimes like this cannot be left unanswered. They cannot be left unpunished. They have to be dealt with, and they have to be dealt with in ways that are meaningful, appropriate, and balanced. And so in this case, balance was going to call ultimately for the death of the firstborn, not of all the children in Egypt, only the firstborn. Note well, it was not just the firstborn of Israelites that were dead. It was all the boys that were to be killed. And here there went a man of the house of Levi. He took to wife a daughter of Levi, and the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him for 3 months. But there's only so long you can keep a child hidden. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes, daubed it with slime and pitch, put the child therein, and laid it in the flags by the river's brink. In a curious way, she was obeying the order. She was throwing her child to the river. But she put him in a little ark made of bulrushes. His sister hid, watching to see what would happen to the child. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside, and she saw the ark among the flags. She sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and the child was weeping. And she had compassion. And she said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." And if this woman had followed her father's edict, she would have thrown the child to the crocks. Right? But she had compassion. And his sister, who was standing nearby, said, "Shall I go call you a nurse of the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said, "Go." Of course, there would be Hebrew women who had breast milk and no baby to nurse because their children had been thrown in the Nile. "Go." And the maid went and called the child's mother, and the Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." And the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, she said, because I drew him out of the water. You know, there's a staggering irony in this. Pharaoh's daughter saved alive the very instrument of God's judgment. If she had followed her father's instruction, Moses would have died and would not have been there to see the burning bush and to be sent back by God to bring the children of Israel out. But God's hand, no doubt, was in this thing from the beginning. So, how does this explain God's wrath and God's judgment on the Egyptians? I think that the fact that we don't really understand the wrath of God is a measure of how cheap life has become for us. Oh, I know we think we value life. But somehow or other, I don't think we grasp how God values life, the life of His children. Consider a medical procedure that's now practiced commonly in this country, and that is, at this moment, perfectly legal. When a woman is late in her pregnancy and wants to terminate it, they do a procedure called dilation and curettage, I think. You have heard it called partial birth abortion. The baby is turned and delivered feet first. And when nothing but the head is left in the birth canal, the doctor punctures the base of the skull with an instrument, inserts a suction tube, sucks out the contents, and kills the baby. And I've heard it said that the babies, when they're brought out of there, their little legs are kicking until the moment when the doctor finally sucks out their brains, and then they stop and go still. It's a barbarous procedure, but it's perfectly legal in our country right now. When this was being debated in the Senate, one senator asked two other senators, well, now what would happen if instead of the baby stopping, if it accidentally slipped completely out of the birth canal, could the doctor still kill it? And two American senators who were on record and caught in C-SPAN on television saying this, and it was finally falsified in the congressional record, you won't find it there, said, well, I suppose that would be a decision for the woman and her doctor to make. How do we get to this point? To where we can consider infanticide? You know, has life become this cheap? Now, how does this differ from the midwives killing the newborn of Israel as they came out of the birth canal? When they're right on the birth stool, they're just born, whack, you kill them right there. How does this differ? How is our system different from Pharaoh's, except for the mandatory nature of his? The fact he required it, they weren't really doing it, but this is his command. In our country, nobody's commanding it, and people are still doing it. It's a strange thing. Now, can you begin to understand why God, who can see all of this, would be angry? I mean, how would it affect you to actually witness a child being killed? How would it affect you to witness a live child out of the birth canal, on a table, being killed? Would it anger you at all? How do you think it affects God? And I don't think God is quite patient enough to understand the difference between 4 inches of its head being in and its head being out. I think God looks at things a little broader than that. But why take it out on the children of Egypt is the next question. The question that the woman asked on the forum. You know, Pharaoh's kids didn't do anything. The Egyptian family's children didn't do anything. There are 2 important things to remember. 1, God can raise the dead. No death is final to Him. In fact, He intends to raise everybody at some time or another. Second, and this is really important for people to understand, God is a God of justice. All the plagues that descended upon Egypt were just. Every one of them corresponded in some symbolic way to the treatment of the slaves of Egypt, all the way down to the death of the firstborn. Think for a moment. What was the first plague that Noah did? Moses did, not Noah. What was the first one? River to blood, right? He goes down and he turns the Nile River into blood. Do you see the connection? Where were they throwing all the Hebrew children? They were throwing them in the Nile. And the first thing that Moses did was turn the waters of the Nile to blood. Don't miss that connection. It's deliberate, because it was the river that claimed the lives not just of the firstborn, but of every male, over what period of time we don't know. Every male in the household of Israel at that time was thrown in that river. People often ask about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. You know, that why did God harden his heart? Why didn't God soften his heart so he could let him go? The reason he didn't want harden his heart so they wouldn't let him go was because justice had to be done. And for justice to be done, this whole scheme had to be played out. Pharaoh's heart, by the way, was hardened in the first place. If you'll go back and you'll read your way through this account, you will find that Pharaoh, with all of his arrogance, was hard to start with. How did God soften his heart? He softened it with a plague. Then how did he harden Pharaoh's heart? He removed the plague. God didn't have to change the wiring in Pharaoh's head. All he had to do was play with it. All he had to do was manipulate circumstances around this man. And the heart was hardened. It's as simple as that. He did so because justice had to be done. Understand this. This is really important for you to understand. Without justice, there is no repentance. Without justice, there is no mercy. Without justice, there is only evil continually. Can we understand why we punish criminals? I mean, why do we put anybody in jail? Why do we put anybody to death? Why do we have any penalties at all for anything that people do? Because of justice. Because we have to somehow demonstrate that something people did was wrong, and we also have to demonstrate how wrong it was. Right? You can't let people off for these things. If you had the same precise prison sentence for a man who stole some VCRs and a man who killed somebody, what you have said is that a human life is not worth any more than some VCRs. That's what you say. Send them both to jail for 5 years. A human life. A kid who was working in a convenience store to get money to go on to college, who was shot by a guy who came into the convenience store. His life is not worth any more than a handful of VCRs if the two criminals get the same penalty. And the fact is that some of the people that you encounter in prison in this country today, the sentences that they are serving make no sense whatsoever. No sense whatsoever. Because the law should make statement by the punishment that we make. It should make some kind of a statement as to the enormity of the crime, the value of whatever it was that was done in this way. That if you don't have justice, there is only evil continually. And so consequently, God, in order to be just, must hold people accountable for what they have done. So, he held Pharaoh and all of the Egyptian people accountable for what they had done. Was it just? Yes, it was. Is it uncomfortable? Yes, it is. Sin is always uncomfortable. And the consequences of sin are always uncomfortable. But you got to understand, you can't make God over into the image you'd like for him to be. You can't make God over into a Santa Claus or a granddaddy in the sky who never punishes. You know, one of the reasons we have granddads is to create a different kind of an image, maybe, of what God is like. But fathers have still got to be there, and the father still has to have the firm hand of discipline, or else his children's lives will be ruined. And so it is that God also has to be there. The death of the firstborn of Egypt was not merely to deliver the Israelites. In fact, that could have been done another way. But that would have dismissed the deaths of thousands of Israelite babies drowned in the Nile, which is why he turned the river into blood. Yes, The idea of vengeance does make me shudder. But you need to understand, vengeance is the central value of justice. You've got to avenge the poor, the weak, and the downtrodden if you're ever going to claim to be a part of a just system. In fact, we ought to shudder at the idea of vengeance. Have you ever thought much about the Civil War? Have you ever connected it to the great evil of slavery practiced and tolerated in this country for so many years? It's kind of hard not to connect it in one sense, because the Civil War is the great pivotal event that ended slavery, although there were other issues involved in the Civil War that didn't have so much to do with slavery. How many soldiers, North and South, died at Gettysburg? I had no way to look today to see how many it was. Thousands, I believe, who died there. And of course, then you go across the other Civil War battlefields and all the thousands and thousands of men who were died, crippled, and maimed in all the fights and the battles that were fought in that war. How many slaves died on ships coming across from Africa and were thrown over the side of the ship? Not even buried at sea, just thrown over the side of the ship with sharks and fish. I don't know. The number runs, I think, to the millions. I think the number of slaves that actually died between the time they were captured and the time they got to a place where they could work and live exceeds the number of people who were killed by far than the ones the Germans killed in World War II and the Holocaust. Do you suppose that it really was in the mind of God to let us get off scot-free for that? It makes me wonder a little bit about the Civil War now that I've begun to think about what happened to the Egyptians and the firstborn of the Egyptians, and what has happened to our own people, that war that we had to fight. And also it makes me wonder if we have any idea of what we spared ourselves by ending slavery. What might have happened to us if we had not ended it, if we had gone on and on. Sooner or later we probably would have. But if the Civil War in any kind is any kind of judgment for God upon our peoples, and the Civil War, the more I read about the thing, the more I read about these battles, the more I see these guys are brothers on both sides of the fence, the less that war makes sense to me. It's a crazy war. It's a terrible war, a bloody war. Why did we have to fight that? Did we have to fight it? Because we had to pay for our national sins of slavery. And justice, ultimately, would have required God to act. It really would. If God cares, if we're God's people at all, justice would require Him to act. And the longer the evil, the greater the punishment. As we approach the end time, the wrath of God will loom larger and larger across the landscape. And in fact, when I speak of the wrath of God, most people's minds will turn toward the end time. They might forget how much the wrath of God has been revealed in years gone by. And there will be fools who just can't understand whatever it is that God is mad about. I want you to turn back with me to Jeremiah, the 7th chapter, for a little insight. Jeremiah chapter 7. What on earth is God so mad about? The word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Stand in the gate of the Lord's house and proclaim here this word. Go up, right on up to the temple. Stand in the gate and say this. Hear the word of the Lord, all ye of Judah, and those that enter the gates to worship the Lord. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel. Amend your ways and your doings, and I will cause you to dwell in this place. Turn your life around, and it'll be all right. Now, again, you've got to understand that unless there is such a thing as justice, mercy doesn't mean anything. What's being offered to these people at this point, if they will amend their ways and their doings, is mercy. They will not have to pay the penalty that they might otherwise have to pay. He said, now don't trust in lying words, saying, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. What he's talking about here is right in the middle of the temple. Here's Jeremiah standing in the doorway. And he's saying to them, don't trust in lying words. The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. What does that mean? Wasn't it? Yeah, it was. What he means by this is, don't assume for a minute that because this is the temple of God, that it can't be brought down. Don't assume that this is a place of safety. Don't assume that God's wrath will never descend upon this place because it has His name upon it. You're making a very big mistake if you do. He said, if you thoroughly amend your ways and your doings, if you thoroughly execute judgment between a man and his neighbor, if you oppress not the stranger, the fatherless, the widow, if you stop shedding innocent blood in this place, and you don't walk after other gods to your hurt, then I will cause you to dwell in this place, in this land that I gave to your fathers forever and ever. Is that too much to ask? Is that really asking a lot? Going to strain something for us to do this? Don't oppress the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. Don't shed innocent blood. Don't walk after other gods to your hurt. That's what I want from you. He says, you trust in lying words that cannot profit. Will you steal, murder, and commit adultery, and swear falsely, and burn incense to Baal, and walk after other gods that you don't know, and then come and stand before me in this house called by my name, and say, we're delivered to do all these abominations? I mean, give me a break, says Jeremiah. How can you say that? And the whole idea is one of the corruption from the top down in Israel, of not only of the worship of God, but their conduct. He's talking about murder. He says, behold, I have seen it, saith the Lord. Is this house which is called by my name become a den of robbers in your eyes? I have seen it, saith the Lord. But now, tell you what you do. You go your way to my place which was in Shiloh, where I set my name at the first, and see what I did to it for the wickedness of my people Israel. And I've told the story before, how I was driving north in a Volkswagen out of Jerusalem one day. Allie and I were on our way up toward Jacob's Well and Mount Gerizim and Ebal, the old cities of the north. And I saw a sign that says Shiloh with an arrow going to the right. And I remember this scripture, go you to my place which was in Shiloh. I thought, well, here I am. I ought to do it. So I hung a right, went bouncing off down this little road and found a place out in the middle of nowhere. And I stopped and I looked around and there was nothing there except an old Arab mosque that was over a couple hundred yards away that apparently dated from about the 10th century. And what are we supposed to go to Shiloh for? There's nothing here. That's the point. You think that this place will be protected because the temple of the Lord is here. Go to Shiloh and see what's there. It's the bare. It's just rocks, just ground, not even any grass at this particular point in time. So what's the message of this? Don't think that just because this is God's house that there's going to be any relief from this. It isn't enough for it to be God's house, to have the name there, to have the form of worship, to have all the rituals and all the ceremonies. It's not enough to have that stuff right. He says, now because you have done these works, saith the Lord, I spoke to you rising up early and speaking, and you wouldn't listen. I called to you, and you wouldn't answer. Therefore I will do to this house, which is called by my name, wherein you trust, and to the place that I gave to your fathers, I will do to this, just like I did to Shiloh. And he did. There came a time when you would go by, not, a little after 70 AD, you could have gone by there, and not been able to figure out where the temple had stood. Wouldn't be evident. Just like when I went to Shiloh, it wasn't evident where anything had stood. I will cast you out of my sight as I have cast out all your brethren, even the whole seed of Ephraim. They were all gone for the same reason. Now therefore pray not for this people. Don't lift up cry or prayer for them. Don't make intercession to me. I will not hear you. And that, folks, is really chilling. Really chilling. He says, do you see what they're doing in the city of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem? The children are gathering wood. The fathers kindle the fire. The women knead the... It's a whole family. Everybody's involved in this. They knead the dough to make cakes to the Queen of Heaven and to pour out drink offerings to other gods, that they may provoke me to anger. Now, I can easily see why someone would say, well, what's the big deal? What's the big deal? We don't mean anything by this. We're just, this, I know it's an old pagan custom, but we're just going to do this, make these cakes to the Queen of Heaven and go through this rigmarole. Why is this such a big deal? Then notice verse 19. Do they provoke me to anger, saith the Lord? Do they not provoke themselves to the confusion of their own faces? And you know something? This baking cakes to the Queen of Heaven is not by itself such a big deal. If that were all there were to it, it probably would not have been such a big deal to God. Problem was, it wasn't all there was to it. Therefore, thus saith the Lord God, behold, my anger and my fury shall be poured out upon this place, upon man, upon beast, upon the trees of the field, the fruit of the ground, and it'll burn, and nobody's going to put it out. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, put your burnt offerings to your sacrifice and eat meat, because I never spoke to your fathers. I never commanded them in the day I brought them out of the land of Egypt concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. It's not what I wanted. Did you realize that? That God never wanted burnt offerings and sacrifices? That the burnt offerings, sacrifices, and the whole system that was put in there was added because of sin. It was a means of dealing with the sins of the people. But this thing commanded I them, saying, obey my voice, I'll be your God, and you'll be my people. You walk in the way that I have commanded you, that it might be well with you. But they wouldn't listen. They wouldn't incline their ear. They walked in the counsels and the imagination of their evil heart, and went backward and not forward. And since the day that your fathers came forth out of the land of Egypt, to this day, I have sent to you all my servants the prophets, daily rising up early and sending them, and they wouldn't listen. They wouldn't incline their ear, they hardened their neck, and they did worse than their fathers. Verse 29, cut off your hair, Jerusalem, cast it away, and take up a lamentation on the high places. For the Lord has rejected and forsaken the generation of his wrath. There is a generation of people, he says, that are going to suffer for this. They are the generation of my wrath. The children of Judah have done evil in my sight, saith the Lord. They have set their abominations in the house which is called by my name to pollute it. And even there, if it had stopped there, it would be one thing. It didn't stop there. And they have built, verse 31, the high places of Tophet, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I didn't command them. It never came into my heart to have that kind of a religion for these people. I don't know, what do they think? They think my religion is too hard, and then they go off with a religion that requires them to burn their own sons and their own daughters in the fire? Do you want to know why God's angry? Wouldn't it make you angry to see someone burn their own children in the fire to another god like this? Are we still capable of anger? Of hating the things that God hates? Being angry at the things that God is angry with? Therefore, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that it shall no longer be called Tophet, or the valley of the son of Hinnom. It's going to be called the valley of slaughter. For they shall bury in Tophet until there's no place left to bury anyone, and the carcasses of this people shall be meat for the fowls of heaven, the beasts of the earth, and no one shall fray them away. Why? For justice. Justice demands it, that a people who would go out and burn their own children in the fire to gods like Moloch deserve to die. They deserve to have their bodies lying out and being picked over vultures and so forth. So, all this is no big deal. You know, we have in our country come to the place to where the wanton destruction of 40 million potential citizens of the United States is no big deal. That's how many have been aborted since Roe v. Wade. Probably more than that, because the count goes up about 1 million a day. Let me ask you this. Do you think that it was the religious aspect of child sacrifice that made it so bad before God? Do you think it would have been okay if they had just disposed of the infants for economic and personal reasons? In other words, I take my kids down to the valley of Tophet, city dump, burning with fires all over the place, and I just throw the kid out there on the fires to burn. Kill him first so he doesn't, have to scream and cry. That would be okay. It's only because they're burning him in the fire to other gods that it's a problem. Do you think that's what was going on here? No one is going to think that for a moment. And that no matter why you do this, no matter why you kill children, it's evil in the sight of God, and God will avenge it, because the children are not themselves going to be around to avenge it, and their children are the weakest of our society. In the course of preparing this message, I came to the conclusion that most of the sin of the world sooner or later comes to rest on the children. He started off in this about talking about the murders and the stealing and the lying and the committing adultery and all the stuff that people do. And in the end, that with all of the adultery, with all the sleeping around, with all the broken homes and all the marriages coming apart, it all comes down on the children in the end. That's where it came to rest in Israel, and that's where it's coming to rest today. And do you realize, that what happens to these aborted children, these babies? They are just incinerated unless they are being used for medical tests. They go up in smoke, or non-smoke through them, because they probably got filters, but they are incinerated in hospital incinerators where they dispose of medical waste. 40 million of them. They never got to that kind of numbers in ancient Israel. Never even came close. And when I looked at this, I thought it might go a little distance in explaining why Jesus had to be born as a baby. He come into this world as a tiny baby, totally vulnerable, totally dependent upon his mother. And they persecuted him even when he was a child. And as a child, his family had to jump up and flee to Egypt to save his life when Herod ordered all the children around Bethlehem to be killed. I don't know how many, dozens, 100 perhaps, maybe more. Little boys lost their lives because Herod wanted Jesus dead. All comes back to the children. Then there was a day when they brought young children to Jesus that he should touch them. His disciples rebuked those that brought them. Jesus saw it. He was really unhappy about that. He said, you permit them, the little children. You suffer the little children to come to me. Don't forbid them, for of such is the kingdom of God. Let the little children come to me, he said. Verily I say unto you, whosoever shall not receive the kingdom of God as a little child, he shall not enter therein. And he took them up in his arms, put his hands on them, and blessed them. You suppose, when all is said and done, one of the primary ways in which we're going to be judged by God has to do with the way we treat the little children? It'll be in there. You can count that. There's a psalm. It's the 127th psalm. Unless the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman wakes, but in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows. He gives his beloved sleep. Lo, children are the heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. As arrows in the hand of a mighty man, so are the children of youth. Children are the heritage of God. How do you think God looks at them? How should he look upon people who destroy children? How should he look upon people who abuse children? They belong to God, folks. The children that you have in your homes, the children that you rock to sleep at night, the children you read stories to, aren't yours. They are the heritage of God. Why? Because God ultimately expects these children to be in his family. And he demands that parents love their children and that they treat their children well. It's not merely respect for life. I was listening to the president's speech the other night on the importance of respect for the life of the elderly and the life of, the weak, the sick, and the life of the unborn. And I agree with him entirely on that. But it's not merely respect for life that's at stake in the abortion issue. It's respect for the heritage of God that is at stake. You understand? That these are not merely life that people are killing. They are more than life. Is it any wonder, then, that the wrath of God might be kindled because of the way men treat little children? Unless you can come to understand that the wrath of God is right, unless you can understand that the wrath of God is righteous, you will never understand the sacrifice of Christ. Because you could just as easily say, why is God upset about that? Why doesn't he just write it off? Why doesn't he just say, I forgive you? Why doesn't he just let it all go? Why was it you see, if you do this, there is no necessity for the death of Jesus. God could just write off your sins. But then there would be no justice. There would be no justice. And God's law is just arbitrary. He could just as easily have said, thou shalt commit adultery, as say, thou shalt not commit adultery. And his law is just what he says it is. Instead of being right, as opposed to wrong. Unless we can come to understand that, unless we understand that God's punishment upon us personally is just, unless we can come to understand that his condemnation of us is just and right, we're not going to understand the sacrifice of Christ. Unless you come to understand that the anger of God is justified, never in this lifetime will you understand mercy. I won't take the time to turn to it, but you might want to read the 5th chapter of Jeremiah for a little bit of an advance on this, because in this passage of Scripture he talks more about the kind of sins. He talks about it in some detail. The kind of sins that we see all around us today all the time. All the way down to the question, as we've just seen in the 7th chapter, of killing their children. Killing their children. Burning them. Whenever you look at this and you go back to Jeremiah 5, there are two different times in this chapter. Another time in chapter 9 when he outlines all this stuff. He says this, "And shall I not be avenged on a nation such as this?" That little word, such an expression, such as this, makes my blood run cold. And the reason is because we are a nation just like that. And God says, I'll be avenged on it. He hasn't gone off somewhere. He hasn't lost interest. He is patient. He is slow to anger, but he does become angry. He does become wrathful. And it's just, and it should be just. He will be avenged, he says, on a nation such as this. Unfortunately, a lot of people who look at prophecy and they read these prophecies, they see them as history written in advance and they try to say, this is a description of what will be. I look at these prophecies as a description of why it will be. Not merely what, but why. And when you understand the why, it ought to scare the daylights out of you about the circumstances that prevail in our country today. For we have not merely lost our respect for God, for life. We have lost our respect for God's life in us. We have lost respect for God's heritage in the children. We have lost respect and fear as a people of God. And we've concluded, there's no reason for God to be mad about this. And if he's really a good God, he wouldn't be mad about this. And we recreate God in our own image. It's a terrifying thing to consider. But ever so often when you read your Bible, you ought to tremble. Because there is justice there. And justice, I'm sorry to say, is what lies on close ahead, I think, on the horizon for us as a people. We have already experienced it in the past in some very painful ways. And we're going to experience it again in the future. However, without justice, mercy has no meaning. And we do know that it is of God's mercies that we are not consumed. And also ahead of us lies some of the greatest examples of the mercy of God that man has ever seen. I'm looking forward to that side of the equation.